I went outside. It was raining, a typical Chicago downpour, cold and mean. I stood under the awning, clutching the envelope with the check in my purse, feeling the drops slap against my cheeks. I wasn't crying. I was simply washing away the remnants of my old life. When I returned home, James was already awake. He was sitting in the kitchen drinking cheap instant coffee and reading the newspaper job ads. He was wearing an old, stretched-out T-shirt I'd mended last week. "Nora? Where were you so late?" "I was starting to worry," he said, looking up at me with his kind, tired eyes. At that moment, I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the check in his face and say, "Look, this is the price of our freedom. No more oatmeal for breakfast. No more cardboard in my shoes." But I said nothing. I simply walked up to him, hugged him from behind, and buried my face in his shoulder. He smelled of home, comfort, and defeat. And in that moment, I realized the most terrifying thing. I no longer belonged in this house. I had outgrown it, like one outgrows a child's dress. For the next 3 months, I lived in the hell of my own double game. James thought I'd received an incredible bonus for my diligence. I bought him a new suit, and we had our first dinner at a real restaurant. He was so happy, so proud of me, and I sat across from him, sipping champagne and feeling like a pathologist dissecting his own happiness. Callahan became my mentor and my curse. He opened doors for me that were boarded up tight for women in those days. He took me to closed meetings, to private clubs where the air was blue with cigar smoke. I sat there, silent and beautiful, like an expensive accessory, but my ears hung on every word. I was learning to understand the language of money. I realized that in real estate, price isn't a figure in a contract. Price is how much your opponent is afraid of losing face. One evening, after another meeting, Callahan dropped me off at his limo and said, "Nora, you're learning faster than I expected. But remember, in this business you can't have friends, only partners and debtors. And if you ever decide that love is more important than assets, you'll lose everything." These words became my manifesto. Soon, I realized Chicago had become too small for me. I needed New York, a city that never sleeps and never forgives weakness. But there was one problem. James. These words became my manifesto. Soon, I realized Chicago had become too small for me. I needed New York, a city that never sleeps and never forgives weakness. But there was one problem. James. The breakup was quiet, but bloody. I didn't confess to his infidelity. Giving him a reason to hate me would have been too merciful. Instead, I made sure he wanted to leave. I became cold. I disappeared at work for days on end. I criticized his every dream, his every achievement. I methodically destroyed his self-esteem until he looked at me with horror and said, "You've become a stranger, Nora. You've become like those people I promised to put in jail." The day he packed his things, I stood by the window and watched him load his old car. He turned around one last time, hoping for the word stay, but I only nodded goodbye. As his car disappeared around the corner, I truly breathed in for the first time in a long time. I was free, and I was alone. A week later, I sold everything we owned, added my commission, and bought a one-way ticket to New York. New York in the 1980s greeted me with the smell of trash, expensive perfume, and boundless opportunity. I had $80,000 in my bag and a heart of steel in my chest. I rented a tiny studio apartment in Manhattan, furnished only with a mattress and a telephone. I started calling major developers. I pretended to be Mr. Callahan's assistant. I lied, I dodged, I charmed their secretaries. I knew I had only one chance to make a name for myself. My target was an abandoned hotel on the Upper East Side. Everyone considered it a lost cause, a piece of junk that could easily be torn down. But I didn't see cracks in the foundation. I saw a future residence for those who wanted to appear aristocratic without having a title. I needed an investor for this deal, and I knew where to find one. At one of those elite clubs where women were only allowed in as escorts, I put on my best dress, the one I'd bought with Callahan's money, and walked in looking like I was in charge. That's where I met Arthur, my second husband. But back then he was just a $2 million check to me. He was rich, bored, and adventurous. I approached him at the bar. "White," I said, looking him straight in the eye, "you spend your money on racehorses that come second. Would you invest in a woman who always comes first?" He laughed. It was the laugh of a man who thought he was a hunter. He didn't know that that evening he had become my greatest investment. I knew Arthur was married. I knew he wasn't used to rejection. But I also knew that men like him only value what they have to fight for. I toyed with him like a cat with a mouse. I gave him hope for intimacy and then disappeared for weeks, forcing him to think only of business and me. Finally, he signed the contract to purchase that very hotel. And that same night, when the signatures dried, I finally allowed him to touch me. It wasn't an act of passion. It was the seal on the document. That's how my journey in New York began. I restored that hotel, turning it into the city's most fashionable spot. My name began appearing in the gossip columns. Nora Vance, the woman who makes money from ruins. I looked at my photos in magazines and thought of Ohio. I thought of the holy shoes and the smell of cheap laundry detergent. Now my shoes cost as much as my father's annual salary, and my perfume could fill that old apartment. But sometimes, late at night, in my huge bedroom on Park Avenue, I would wake to a sound that seemed familiar. I thought I heard James stirring his coffee in the kitchen. I reached out but found only the cold silk of the sheets and the emptiness beside me. Was it worth it? When I look at my bank account, I say yes. When I look at the Manhattan skyline, I say yes. But when I look in the mirror, I see a woman who learned to build skyscrapers but never learned to sleep soundly. That was my first victory, and my first real loss. Because that night when I sold my loyalty to Callahan, I sold more than just my body. I sold the ability to love without regard for profit. But you know what? Bills in the Hamptons aren't paid with love. And I promised myself at 12 that I would never fear debt collectors again. Promise kept, Mom. You would hate me, but you would definitely be proud. In the next chapter, I'll tell you how my second husband, Arthur, discovered my business methods and why our divorce became the most profitable deal of the decade. But that's another story, and another man in my bed.